What if? The Cold War turned hot. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was one of constant suspicion. This created an uneasy peace that lasted for over 4 decades. But what if this tension boiled over into a full-blown conflict? What if the Cold War had become hot? Let's find out. Hello, and welcome to this channel where we try and answer the great geographic what-if questions of the world. I'm your host, and today we're going to explore what would have happened if the Cold War had turned hot. In order to understand how a Cold War could turn hot, we first need to understand what a Cold War is. A Cold War is a state of hostility that exists between two states primarily characterized by an ideological struggle rather than open warfare. The term was coined in 1947 by the American journalist and writer Walter Lippmann. He used it to describe the state of relations between the US and the USSR following the end of World War II. The primary reason for the animosity between the two superpowers was their conflicting ideologies. The US championed democracy and capitalism, while the USSR stood for communism and authoritarian rule. These differences were not just theoretical. They were put into practice through actions. Both superpowers took steps to expand their spheres of influence. The US supported countries that were friendly to them and provided aid to those who were struggling economically or politically. This was done through organizations like the Marshall Plan, which provided over $13 billion in aid to help rebuild Western Europe after the devastation of World War II. The Soviets did the same with their sphere of influence. Countries like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Latvia became communist states aligned with the USSR. This division of Europe into Eastern and Western halves became one of the most prominent features of the Cold War. This desire to expand their spheres of influence led to proxy wars. These were conflicts where the superpowers did not fight directly, but instead supported opposing sides. Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan are examples of proxy wars during the Cold War. Each of these conflicts further increased the tensions between the US and the USSR. Despite all this, there was never any large-scale direct conflict between the two superpowers. That might seem surprising considering the hostile rhetoric from both sides. There were even times when the possibility of nuclear war loomed large. Two such instances were the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 and the 1983 Able Archer 83 NATO exercise. Both brought the world to the brink of nuclear disaster. However, despite all the antagonism, the Cold War remained cold. There are many reasons for this. One of the most important was the concept of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War. It's based on the idea that a nuclear attack against one side would provoke a response that would destroy both. Therefore, it acts as a strong deterrent since the consequences of such an action are so dire. Another reason why the Cold War remained cold was the high cost of war. During the latter half of the 20th century, the cost of modern warfare was very high. Just consider the Vietnam War. Between 1955 and 1975, the US spent over $150 billion on the war, which was over $1 trillion in today's money. Even if the US and the USSR had limited the conflict to Europe, the cost would have been staggering, especially when considering that both sides had the capability to destroy each other many times over with the weapons they possessed. Finally, both superpowers understood that a hot war would have far-reaching consequences beyond just military engagements. The collapse of economies, widespread famine, and the spread of disease. The COVID pandemic showed us how interconnected our world really is. The leaders of the US and the USSR knew that a war between them would have global consequences, something neither wanted. So with all these factors at play, it seems unlikely that the Cold War would have escalated into a hot one. However, let's entertain this hypothetical. Our world. One of the most immediate impacts would have been the loss of life. Estimates of the number of people killed in a direct conflict between the US and the USSR vary widely. Some estimates put it in the tens of millions, while others go as high as 200 million. This is a staggering number, especially when you consider that the deadliest war in human history World War II, resulted in around 70 million deaths. But it's not just about the number of people killed. A hot Cold War would have resulted in mass displacement, destroyed economies, and disrupted trade on a global scale. It would have also likely triggered a complete breakdown of the global order. Many countries would have been drawn into the conflict, either because of their alliances or their strategic importance. For example, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan would have likely been drawn into the conflict on the side of the United States. On the other side, China, North Korea, and Vietnam would have probably sided with the USSR. This would have turned the conflict into a truly global one. Another major consequence of a hot Cold War would have been the proliferation of nuclear weapons. As the conflict dragged on, more countries would have felt the need to acquire nuclear weapons to protect themselves. This would have led to a situation where many more countries would possess these weapons today, and we all know how volatile that could be. It's difficult to say how a hot Cold War would have ended. Perhaps the US and the USSR would have eventually negotiated a peace deal. Or maybe one side would have emerged victorious. But one thing is certain: the world as we know it would not exist. If the Cold War had become hot, our world would be very different today. Instead of the relative peace and cooperation we see today, we would likely be living in a world consumed by conflict and fear of nuclear war. The environment would be degraded due to the extensive use of weapons, and resources would be depleted. It's hard to imagine that any good would have come out of a hot Cold War. Perhaps the only positive aspect would be the end of the Cold War itself. Since both superpowers would likely be completely destroyed in the process, whatever came after would be a world without the spectre of nuclear war hanging over it. It's therefore in our best interest to ensure that such a conflict never happens. We can learn from the past and work towards a future where ideological differences are resolved through dialogue and cooperation rather than through violence. What do you think? How would a hot Cold War have changed our world? Would we be better off today or worse off? Let me know in the comments below. And with that ends yet another edition of What If, this time exploring what would have happened if the Cold War had turned hot. If you like this video, please feel free to subscribe. It's free and helps get this content out to more people. I'd also like to take a moment to say a special thank you to our supporters, whose names you can see on screen right now. If you'd like to see your name on the screen and contribute to the production of these videos, please consider supporting us. The link to that is in the description. As always, thanks for watching. More videos coming soon.